Welcome to our deep dive. Today we're going to be exploring Advaita Vedanta, and we're going to be looking at it through the lens of Mandana Misra. And to help us understand his ideas, we'll be using the book Advaita Vedanta by R. Balasubramanian. It was published way back in 1976 by the University of Madras.
Yeah, that's right. And that book really focuses on Mandana Misra's Brahma. It's a key text in this whole tradition.
So this deep dive kind of tackles some pretty complex stuff. We're going to be talking about the nature of reality, how we even know things, and even how we make mistakes in our understanding.
Absolutely. And, the book itself is structured around the 4 chapters of the Brahma. It looks at things like perception, the idea of error, and in the end, it tries to help us understand what Advaita Vedanta says about the nature of reality.
So let's start with some of the core ideas of Advaita Vedanta. One of those is this concept of Brahman. It's often described as the absolute. Can you maybe explain what that means?
Brahman is the ultimate reality in this system. It's seen as eternal, blissful, and the source of all knowledge. Think of it kind of like the underlying reality that exists beyond our everyday perceptions.
That's a pretty big idea to wrap our heads around. So how do we even begin to know this Brahman, this ultimate reality, as humans?
Well, Mandana Misra outlines 6 ways we can gain knowledge: perception, inference, comparison, presumption, verbal testimony, and nonverbal testimony. But he argues that the most reliable way, at least when it comes to Brahman, is something called Shruti.
Shruti, what's that?
Shruti refers to the Vedic scriptures. These are considered the most authoritative source of knowledge in Advaita Vedanta. They are believed to be like eternal truths revealed to these ancient sages.
So he's saying to understand the ultimate reality, we need to look beyond our limited senses and rely on these ancient texts. Why not put more emphasis on our own experiences and observations?
He argues that things like perception, inference, comparison, they're limited by our senses and experiences.
You're saying our senses can deceive us?
You see a shape in the distance and think it's a cow, right? That's inference based on limited perception. But it doesn't tell you everything about that cow.
Okay, so we need a higher form of knowledge to understand Brahman. But if our senses are unreliable, how do we explain making mistakes? How does Advaita Vedanta deal with error?
That's a big question. There are different schools of thought about it. One, the Prabhakara perspective, says error comes from combining 2 incomplete pieces of knowledge.
Can you give me an example?
Think about mistaking a piece of nacre for silver. The Prabhakaras would say it's because you don't fully grasp both nacre and silver, so you mix them up.
What about other viewpoints? What about Mandana Misra?
Mandana Misra, taking the Advaita view, says error is due to a positive misconception. It's something we project onto reality and then correct later.
So we're adding something that isn't really there. What's an example?
Like with the nacre and silver, you're superimposing the idea of silver on the nacre. It's not just a lack of understanding. You're actively misattributing qualities to it.
So our minds are more active in creating error. But how does he justify that? It seems to go against common sense.
Well, he uses several arguments. For example, just because you perceive something doesn't mean it's accurate. Like, a jaundiced person sees a white conch as yellow.
Our individual state influences perception. How does he use that to challenge the Prabhakara view?
He says cases like the jaundiced person show error is more than just incomplete knowledge. It's about misinterpreting reality. He also critiques the Prabhakara explanation of dream errors.
So understanding error is key to understanding reality itself. It seems like this discussion of error and perception leads to a bigger question. What is the nature of reality according to Advaita Vedanta?
That's where it gets really interesting. Advaita Vedanta says reality is non-dual. There's no fundamental separation between things. And Mandana Misra really goes all in on this, challenging the very idea that difference is real.
That sounds like a pretty radical idea. How does he make his case?
For one thing, he says our perception of difference is often an illusion. Like with the shell and silver, we mix things up because of our preconceived ideas and the limits of our senses.
So our minds create the illusion of separation. That's a big claim. What are his arguments against the concept of difference?
We'll dive into those fascinating arguments in the next part of our deep dive. Stay tuned. So we were talking about Mandana Misra and how he challenges this whole idea of difference being fundamental to reality. One of his main arguments is about how we perceive things.
Okay, how does perception play into it?
He says when we look at an object, like when we really perceive it, we're only grasping its individual characteristics. We don't actually perceive its difference from other things right then and there.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Imagine you're looking at a pot, right? You see its shape, its size, maybe its color, but you're not automatically seeing that it's different from, say, a table. That comes later. It's a judgment we make based on our ideas about categories.
So the act of seeing something doesn't inherently include recognizing its difference from other things.
Exactly. Difference is something our minds add on. It's not actually baked into the objects themselves.
Interesting. So what else does he say about this idea of difference? What other arguments does he use?
He also goes after this notion of negation, the idea that we define things by saying what they're not.
Oh, right.
And he says, even when we do that, we're still relying on the concept of both things. Like, if you say the sky lotus doesn't exist, you're still kind of bringing up this idea of a sky lotus, even if it's just to deny it.
So negation doesn't really prove that things have a separate existence.
Right. It still depends on this framework in our minds where both the thing and its opposite exist, as concepts. And he actually goes on to look at other arguments for difference, too, like the idea that things are distinct because they have opposite qualities. He really breaks all these arguments down systematically.
He really wants to shake up how we think about the world. So we've talked a lot about error and illusion, but what is it that actually causes us to misperceive reality in this way, according to Advaita Vedanta, that is?
That's where the concept of avidya comes in.
Avidya. Okay, break that down for us.
Avidya is often translated as ignorance, basically a lack of knowledge. It's like this veil that prevents us from seeing reality clearly. It's what makes us see separation where there's really just unity.
So avidya is why we see a fragmented world instead of a whole one.
Exactly. You could think of it like a distorted lens. It makes us see things that aren't really there, and it also makes us miss the underlying unity.
Earlier you mentioned Mandana Misra and his idea that error arises through something called superimposition. Does that connect to this avidya concept?
Absolutely. Superimposition, or ayesa in Sanskrit, is kind of a key way that avidya works. It's the process of projecting our own mental stuff, our ideas and misconceptions, onto reality.
So avidya makes superimposition possible.
Exactly. It sets us up to make mistakes by encouraging us to superimpose our limited understanding onto the world.
So how does this superimposition actually happen? Does Mandana Misra explain that?
He does. He says there are 5 specific conditions that need to be in place for error to happen.
5 conditions? Like what?
The first one is that there has to be no valid way of knowing the object. In Sanskrit, this is called pramay. It's like if you're in total darkness, you can't see anything clearly, right?
It's not just our senses then. It's about not having the right tools for knowing something. What's the second condition?
That there's a defect in the actual instrument of knowledge. This is pramatana. Like, imagine trying to look through a telescope with a cracked lens.
It'll distort the image. Makes sense. What's the third one?
The third condition is a defect in the object of knowledge itself. That's called jnana. It's like trying to measure a mountain that's completely covered in fog.
So sometimes it's not about us, it's the thing itself that's hard to know. What are the last 2?
Number 4 is when we have this leftover mental impression from a past experience, but it doesn't actually match the object we're perceiving. That's motiviparita saskara. Think of a memory that's become distorted over time.
Oh, so our past experiences can actually mess up our understanding of what's happening right now. What's the last condition?
The 5th one is when there's a similarity between the object and something else, which leads us to mistake them for each other. Sarya. It's that classic rope and snake mix-up.
Those 5 conditions paint a pretty clear picture of how we can end up with a distorted understanding of the world. But we've focused a lot on the negative side here, with limitations and illusion and error. What does Advaita Vedanta and Mandana Misra specifically offer as a path towards true knowledge, towards liberation?
That's a great question. And it's important to remember that even though Advaita Vedanta talks a lot about illusion, it also gives us a way to realize the truth of this non-dual reality.
And what does that path look like? How do we move past this avidya and experience the unity of Brahman?
That's what we'll explore in the final part of our deep dive. Stay with us.
So in this deep dive, we've been talking about Mandana Misra's Advaita Vedanta, about perception and error and this avidya concept. But what I'm really curious about now is what this philosophy offers us as a way forward. What's the path to real knowledge, to liberation?
Well, a core idea in Advaita Vedanta is that our true nature is already one with Brahman, with that ultimate reality. So the path isn't really about getting something new. It's more about removing the obstacles that prevent us from recognizing what's already there, that unity.
So it's about getting rid of avidya, that veil.
Yeah, Exactly. It's about seeing through the illusion of separateness and realizing that our true identity is Brahman.
That's a pretty big shift in how we see things. How do we actually make that happen? What does the path involve?
Advaita Vedanta emphasizes several things. There's self-inquiry, which is about questioning all our assumptions and beliefs about ourselves and the world. And there's meditation, which helps us calm and clear the mind. And also ethical living, which sort of creates a foundation of harmony and balance.
So it's not just a matter of intellectually understanding it. It's also about how we live, what we do. Sounds like a pretty big journey.
It is a journey. And even though the goal is liberation, the path itself is really valuable. As we start to let go of that sense of separateness, it changes how we relate to everything, ourselves, other people, the world around us.
Can you talk more about that? How does realizing our unity with Brahman actually affect how we live?
Well, when we see that our true nature is inseparable from the whole, our actions tend to become more compassionate, more understanding. That sense of isolation and ego starts to fall away, and we feel a much deeper connection to everything.
That's a beautiful idea. It sounds like Advaita Vedanta is more than just an abstract philosophy. It's really a whole way of life.
It is. It asks us to live more consciously, with purpose, and with this deep connection to the divine, both within us and in all beings.
Well, this has been a really eye-opening deep dive into Advaita Vedanta, and especially Mandana Misra's take on it.
It's always fascinating to explore these teachings and to see how relevant they still are today.
As we wrap things up, we want to leave you with something to think about. If the world really is non-different from Brahman, how might that change how you act, how you relate to others, and even your sense of purpose? Until next time, keep seeking, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep.